the change in the composition of our population since the 1960s gradually and accelerating with the catastrophe of the Boris wave is unlike anything else. The decision that the only way you could control the resistance to immigration was by suppression. And the catastrophes are built up because we've adopted a culture of suppression. What we've had is, exactly as in the Soviet Union, an entire political culture based on lies. Lying about output, lying about finance, lying about freedom, lying about communism, lying about everything.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, David Starkey. David, welcome to the show.
A pleasure to be back.
It's so good to have you back on. I feel like it's been years since we
It
last had a
has.
conversation. So it's really good to be able to have another one, especially as there are so many things happening in this country right now, in this once great nation of ours, that I think people want to hear your views about. It's a febrile moment. Things are being shaken up. Things are getting interesting, one might say. So to kick off, I guess I want to ask you what you think the temperature of Britain is right now. Not the literal temperature, but the the political, moral temperature. We've got the protests at the migrant hotels. We've got this new movement raising the English and the Union flag all over the country. We've got people expressing extreme anger against the government and officialdom for failing to protect our borders. All these things that I want to get into you about. But what do you think is the general temperature right now? How febrile are things?
Well, febrile means literally feverish.
Right.
That's what the word actually means. It's a medical condition, which, of course, is often, when it gets rather bad, associated with delirium. It's a really interesting word that you've chosen to use it. And in other words, we're applying a term of by the way, I'm not a medical doctor. We're applying a term of medical analysis to the state of the country. And I think there's a very good reason for doing it. It is feverish. We're not yet at the point where there is this move towards a steady crisis. Issue comes up, slightly fades away, never disappearing completely. Another one comes along, and it probably ratchets the overall state of the things up a little bit more. And of course, most of them, well, in fact, the great bulk of them, all of the ones you've been talking about, cluster around these two key issues, which are different sides of the same coin. They're the issue of immigration on the one hand. Remember, it's very important. We emphasize this time after time after time. Britain is not a nation of immigrants. Britain was not built by immigrants, unless you count the Irish navvies of the last century, when, of course, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. Very important. Very important we say that. That yes, if you go back far enough to the days of the Roman invasion, to the days of the Danish invasion, the Anglo-Saxon invasion, the Norman invasion, that is 1,000 years ago. It's also paralleled in every other European country. If we even Italy, North Italy is Lombardy. The Lombards were a Germanic tribe invading the Roman Empire. France is, of course, used to be called Gaul. It used to be a Celtic nation before it was conquered by Rome. Then it's invaded by, again, wide selections, that's funny way to describe marauding tribes of German warriors, the Franks being the most important, which is why it's called Francia or France. So all European countries with the breakup of the Roman Empire experience, even Spain, some form or another of northern Germanic invasion. Now, this does not mean that in any sense that the people that result from that are any less indigenous than anywhere else in the world. And it's a point, of course, with this, as it were, denial, this absurd, preposterous denial of the authenticity and the rootedness of Western civilization by the fashionable movements in universities and the whole critical race theory and whatever, that we have absolutely forgotten. Our population, in terms of its genetic, if you like to talk about its genetic origins, is astonishingly stable. The numbers of Romans, of even Anglo-Saxons, Danes, Normans is relatively tiny. Many people of these islands go back to the Bronze Age. There have been really interesting DNA tests. We are an indigenous people with the admixture, and of course the product of this extraordinary accretive culture from the Norman conquest, the addition of a French culture onto a Germanic people, and the result, wonderful fusion of the English language. But that does not mean we're a nation of immigrants. Even the admixtures of Protestants from the Netherlands in the 16th century and Protestants from France in the 18th century, the so-called Huguenots, people very similar to us, sharing a religion, welcomed by the official establishment as refugees, triggered enormous problems, really serious debates over citizenship. So what we've got to do, we've got to realize that the change in the composition of our population since the 1960s gradually and accelerating with the catastrophe of the Boris wave from 2019 is unlike anything else in all our experience. And of course, with absolutely infinite radical differences. Since the Romans, everybody who came here one way or another was, as it were, part of the Northern European landmass. And since the Norman conquest, everybody, well, yes, that would be right. Since the Norman conquest, all were Christian, one form or another. There's now something radically, utterly different. We are run increasingly not by politicians, but by people who regard themselves as superior experts, who look down on the rest of us as the old-fashioned arrogant surgeon did on a rather stupid patient. Simply somebody, as it were, either to be soft-soaped or to be brutally experimented upon. And that's exactly what has happened. And what there is happening, of course, is a response, is a reaction. And the phenomena you were talking about, the protests outside the hotels, the extraordinary outbreak of flag waving, something that is, one constantly says, is not terribly English. You deployed flags for occasions of ceremony, usually royal ceremony. Because remember, one of the other things that is an extraordinary accompaniment of this strange shift in the literal composition of the body politic is the long withdrawing roar of the monarchy. When I was a boy, the central core of British identity, as opposed to all our constituent nations, England, France, so what am I I really am getting confused in my own historical period. England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. And your British identity, insofar as you thought about it at all, was the loyalty to the crown. That was how it was defined. The centrality of the crown in everyday experience, the playing of the national anthem at the end of every theatre performance, every cinema performance, the standing for it, the extraordinarily important role of the Church of England as either the Tory party at prayer, or you could describe it as English Shinto, the English worshipping themselves through the position of the King Emperor, all gone. And instead, these new elites decided they would impose new values that apparently were held together by these mysterious things called British values. And when you examine their British values, all newly minted as part of this gigantic reinvention of the British state. Because again, Brendan, we've experienced something totally extraordinary. We've experienced a slow burn revolution since 1997, in which you've reinvented not simply the structure of the state, the great Blairite transformation, in which you distributed power from elected politicians, that's to say, people like that you and me can remove, to this body of experts, the staff of the quangos, the civil service, and above all, a newly intensely politicized judiciary, delivering, as we all know, I'm afraid, two-tier justice. And this isn't just a term of abuse, it's actually written into human rights law. This is what we forget. What's going on is legally entrenched. And the great proponent of human rights law, Lord Bingham, actually spills the beans in a lecture in Australia when he says quite explicit, human rights law is anti-democratic. It's counter-majoritarian. It's deliberately designed to protect these minorities, and he lists them, to protect minorities against the majority, and he lists them, the mentally ill, the Roma. Well, look, you're beginning to sound like a list of the more absurd decisions of the courts. I mean, starting with Rudakabana and Kalokani, of course, who should have been in secure mental hospitals from the age of about 10. Now, what you're talking about is the reaction. The reaction is similarly, what I worry, profoundly un-English. Because what are you doing when you're posting these flags everywhere? Where in the British Isles, until recently, was the only place that you would have found that? Where?
Northern Ireland?
Yes, Ulster.
Yeah.
Ulster. I was there earlier this year, and I was last in Ulster, last actually as a tourist in Ulster. It sounds an extraordinary thing, at the very beginning of the Troubles in 1972. And what I hadn't realised, because of course one gets very little serious news from Northern Ireland, was that the Troubles hadn't really gone away. They'd just been frozen. And what you have there is sectarian areas, areas where the Union Jack is flown, or areas where the Irish tricolour is flown, areas where one set of gangsters dominate or another set of gangsters dominate. And what terrifies me is that what was peculiar, what was characteristic, what was the grounds that this extraordinary, stable Anglo-British state created was one where the individual mattered. We suppressed groups, we suppressed clans, we suppressed, of course, we were profoundly individualistic and fascinatingly divided society, along with other things that held us together, like clubs and trade unions and all sorts of things. But what we were not, we were not divided into clans. And the whole business of what happens in Scotland after the 45 is the deliberate destruction of clanism and its absorption instead into the British Army with the Highland regiments and all that sort of thing. The English state in particular, been profoundly aggressive. The reason that we are able to enjoy individual rights of justice, individual rights at law, is the destruction of clans. But what we've done, we've imported, I'm afraid, clans that many of the things that have created this outrage that you're talking about, the protests outside hotels and so on, they are in response to the grooming gangs. But the problem with the grooming gangs, they're not gangs, Brendan. They behave like gangs. They are clans. They're groups of relations. They're fathers, brothers, uncles, first cousins, second cousins, third cousins, because these are communities that practice cousin marriage, which is why, of course, they're called communities, which is why they've got their community leaders. And of course, what the British state has done is already, by its implicit acknowledgement of them, to begin the process of sectarianism that now largely symbolized either by the flying of the Pakistani flag, which has become very characteristic. You saw when it was Pakistani Independence Day, the complete takeover in certain parts of the country, or increasingly the use of the Palestinian flag. In other words, these so-called communities led the way in Ulsterization, in sectarianism. What we've seen, which was obviously on the cards, led by people like Tommy Robinson, as you would expect, is the beginning of the British response. The British working class are starting to behave in the same way. We're seeing the emergence of so-called community leaders within the British working class, exactly as happened in Northern Ireland.
Those of you who follow me will know just how much online content is being restricted right now if you live in the UK. But a solution is at hand with the help of our partners at Private Internet Access, or PIA for short. PIA is the VPN I use and trust. In case you don't know, a VPN, or virtual private network, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. Whenever you're browsing online on an unprotected device, your device is transmitting a lot of personal information out into the open, which can be seen by multiple parties before it reaches the website you're trying to visit. Instead of giving away your personal information and location to the world, PIA lets you change your IP address to one of 91 countries. This means you can gain access to websites and services that are only available in those locations. And it's not just that. Did you know that streaming services like Netflix and Prime Video have huge catalogs of content, but you can only access a fraction of it from your own country? Using PIA to change your location opens up a whole new world of streaming. I love it. Paying for Netflix without using PIA is a bit like paying for front row seats at the cinema but being forced to sit in the hallway. I also use it all the time when I'm traveling to catch up with what's going on at home. Because PIA is available for all platforms, I never need to worry about my safety or privacy. It works on Windows, Apple Macs, iPhones, Androids, and more. Even better, you only need one subscription to protect yourself across all the devices you own. So sign up now to the world's most transparent VPN provider and take advantage of our special offer. Viewers of my show can get 86% off a subscription to Private Internet Access. So that's just £1.67 a month. And you also get an extra 4 months thrown in completely for free. To take advantage of this incredible deal, just go to piavpn.com/Brendan. That's piavpn.com/Brendan. Signing up is totally risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. You won't regret it. Sign up now at piavpn.com/Brendan. I think your discussion of the slow reinvention of the British state and also the idea of Britain itself is a really interesting point. And I did want to ask you why you think there's so much reluctance, I guess, amongst the chattering classes, the influential classes, to admit the uniqueness of what's been happening largely since 1997, but also really post-60s in terms of the waves of immigration, the size of it, the out-of-control nature of illegal immigration. I mean, we're talking 500 or 600 unvetted men crossing our shores every day. I mean, that I can't think of any period in history or any nation in history where that would be seen as an acceptable thing.
There was the stretch of Biden's America with exactly the same kind of political lying about it, and the numbers were vastly greater until that extraordinary moment when Trump moves from the rotunda, having been sworn in, to the Oval Office, and the first on that enormous pile of executive orders presented to him by the Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, who ever since the ending of the first Trump presidency has been working on making sure that the second one was a very different and very kind, much more structured enterprise. The first on there was an executive order closing the border. And do you know what? That border was closed. Why has our, and again, it's important we make this point, there's been an astonishing Americanization of our politics. People think increasingly of the right and the new right as following Trump. The most important thing, of course, is that the left has followed blindly what's been going on in Democrat America. All the movements we are talking about, all the movements, critical race theory, we are a nation of immigrants, the whole nonsense of the poisonous nonsense of transgenderism, all these are American imports. And the left has been, Gordon Brown in particular, wildly seduced by all this. But the great problem is you were bringing these into the wildly different structure of Britain, of this extraordinarily stable, subtle and supple state, 1,000 years old. We literally have a political structure that goes back to Magna Carta, that was until 1997 deliberately unbroken, and is then broken in 1997. We've had a slow burn French Revolution, which did even what the French Revolution didn't dare to, changed its population. And there's a wonderful joke of another country that had all sorts of problems with lying to its population. Because one of the other ways people talk about how our elite is behaving, is like the elite of the latter days of the Soviet Union, or the Soviet satellites before Glasnost, before 1989. An entire culture based on lying about output, lying about finance, lying about freedom, lying about communism, lying about everything. And so there are these very, very remarkable parallels. Why the resistance to admitting it? Because these people live by the lies. That their entire worldview is founded on the lies. And it's really important we understand this, that there's a marvelous phrase in T.S. Eliot, mankind cannot stand too much reality. And what we've had is exactly as in the Soviet Union, an entire political culture based on lies. We've had it begins with Enoch Powell, essentially with Enoch. With the decision following Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, that the only way you could control the resistance to immigration was by suppression. That the entire issue of what was then black immigration could not be talked about from that point. And the catastrophes have built up because we've adopted a culture of suppression. This is the Race Relations Act is the moment Powell forecasted. He said it in that speech. It's the moment at which we've decided to shut the white population up. And that means, of course, if you try to govern by shutting people up rather than by debating problems, the problems just exacerbate and grow and become feverish, to go back to the words with which we began this discussion. And what you try to do is simply suppress it. You try to suppress it. You do the equivalent of shoving ice packs on people. You don't deal with the actual original problem. And the problem is we've seen in every other way, not simply immigration, not simply multiculturalism. What else have we seen it with? We've seen it with the whole focus of our economic policy on the supposed mitigation of climate change. Astonishingly foolish idea. I mean, not that I am not a scientist. I have no idea why we're clearly going through a warming phase. I would suspect it's actually a mild one. The human beings are perfectly capable of mitigating the consequences of this without gigantic changes of behavior. We have a more effective range of technologies than ever before. It's also, of course, strikingly clear we contribute less than 1% of global emissions. The whole attempt at transforming very quickly, as a decision, by the way, we've been blaming the left. It's important to understand the complicity of the so-called right. The reason that we are having, the reason Miliband is able to do what he is, the reason that things are moving at the speed that they're doing with the grotesque economic consequences of, for example, electricity prices, which are 4 times American, 4 times, which are the essential basis of the current unbelievably rapid deindustrialization of Britain. That is the consequence of Theresa May. That is the consequence of probably, she's even worse than Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson, catastrophic on immigration. Theresa May, with the decision, totally unthinking and unthought through and effectively undebated in Parliament, to make the goal of net zero by 2050 legally binding. That gives judges, again another lot of these experts, the right to set fuel extraction policy. It's judges, not Miliband, who rule that you couldn't actually open oil fields in the North Sea. It's judges, not Miliband, who rule that you couldn't frack. So we're in this grotesque situation, and that's another set of lies. And it's again the absurdity of one of the ways we are going to generate renewables. Now, renewables are perfectly sensible. They're by no means cost-free. The enormous costs of wind turbines. By the way, I think we should call them windmills. That would enable us to understand this is a regressive technology. The whole point about the technologies that replaced windmills were that they were continuous, not occasional. Because, of course, the wind only blows occasionally, and we do not actually use electricity occasionally. We don't put our fingers up, like, there's a bit of wind. We can use electricity now. And unfortunately, the wind tends to blow strongest in the most remote regions of the country. And electricity doesn't magically get there. It's got to be transmitted. So we are, I don't know whether you've noticed, and we're lied to about this fact, we are spending, can you guess how many £100 million a year to tell the owners of wind farms to turn off? How many?
How many?
£800 million a year we are spending. It's and when you do that, by the way, you've got to pay another fortune to generate the necessary electricity by gas. What again our elites have done, they've given us words. The left and the new and the sort of Theresa May right adore words. They remember the whole of multiculturalism, the whole of the climate emergency business. They're religious, especially transgenderism. These are religious movements. They are powerful belief systems which you adopt because they're good, because they're right, because the world is going to be saved and made a better place. They're not good. Conservatives believe in reality, or they should do. They believe in the fact that the world is never going to be made perfect. The best we can do is to muddle along because we're complex, fallible creatures. We are better able to muddle along than any previous generation because we command amazing technology that most of it was originally developed here in the British Isles. But the trouble is we've been taken over by these quasi-religious movements. And there are means of propagandization. The last time you had this happening was in the 16th and 17th century when radical Protestantism came to England and even worse to Scotland. And again, there was a takeover by a tiny minority of highly educated people. And the vehicles for spreading it were exactly what they are now, with the universities and the educational system. And that's what's happened. And of course, these are utterly remote from the values of, if you like, ordinary people, which is why these educated elites, and you look every time there's a spat on Twitter, you see the sneers. The left, the believers in goodness, kindness, democracy, liberalism, have developed this rictus sneer, this sneer of contempt for the great unwashed. You saw the glimmers of it again going back to flags. Emily Thornberry on the white van man with his flag. The Lady Nuji, of course, and absolutely entrenched member, a double member of this elite, and herself a lawyer, and she may even be a KC, an honorary KC, I can't remember, deeply frustrated that she wasn't made Labour Attorney General, married to a judge, chairman of a parliamentary committee, all of this stuff, right, with, of course, the hyper sneer. And it's all been brilliantly analysed by David Goodhart. The two species, the anywheres, the globalized liberal elites, the smoothies, the super educated smoothies, and the somewheres, the people at Epping, the people in Canary Wharf. And this is a division within ourselves, within Britain. Now, I find it fascinating. It's prefigured, of course, by some of our greatest literature. There's a book which I remember reading, I must have been 16, I suppose, when I first read 1984, and you thought of it as really, really rather good, but very far-fetched, wasn't it? And particularly, in 1984, Dawes, there were all sorts of essays saying, "Oh, well, really, old Orwell, remember, he was very ill when he wrote it. He died shortly afterwards, It was all very highly coloured, wasn't it? It was the experiences of the Spanish Civil War. Marvellous literature, but now, of course, we can see it as a prophecy so astonishing, so complete. Even, Brendan, and I keep pointing this fact out, a prophecy about the state of international relations, that the world has indeed dissolved back into those blocks that he talked about. Oceania, us, Eurasia, them, the South. Quite extraordinary, as well as what we are talking about, a politics of lies. Hence, that great essay at the end of great essay on language, on Newspeak, at the end of 1984. Or again, all this has got a very, very long pedigree. It goes back directly to Plato. Plato, again, believed in the rule of experts. And central to the Republic is a doctrine of lying. It is the noble lie. The noble lie, and Plato wants to believe that government should be the work of the expert, those marvelously intelligent and people without any self-interest at all, the philosopher king. And you've got to persuade people that everybody else is made of an inferior metal. They're the gold. The sort of warrior classes are the bronze. The rest of us are the mere iron. And you have that myth of a creation of essentially different species of human beings. So that idea of the lie is so powerfully entrenched. And interestingly enough, that word noble cropped up in one of the most memorable comments on all of this. And that was the historian, or he's really a novelist, but he's a jolly good popular historian, Tom Holland, who back in 2015, when there was the first wave of, thanks to the Times, the first real news about the grooming gangs broke. And Holland used this phrase noble. He said, that it was wrong, I suppose, rather unwillingly conceded, to suppress talk about the grooming gangs, but at least the aim was noble because of the values of multiculturalism. You see, it's this sense that the lies, well, they're really a good thing. Climate change matters supremely. Critical race theory matters supremely. Multiculturalism matters supremely. Therefore, we've got to, well, lie about them. And moreover, when people start complaining about the lies, if you like what's going on now, the British people, or an important section of them, they're behaving like the little boy in the Hans Andersen fairy story. They're crying out that the emperor's got no clothes. Well, I'm afraid you've got to shut them up, don't you? It's why suddenly we're seeing this whole movement to suppress what used to be the proudest claim of being Anglo-British. You were free. You read our literature from the late Middle Ages onwards, culminating, of course, in the 18th and the 19th century. That sense of pride in freedom, now suppressed, vanishing, deliberately sat upon.
Yeah, I think I think many listeners will agree with you that we live under a web of lies, or a whole edifice of lies on so many different issues.
Yeah.
And in relation to people's pushback against some of that, I did want to ask you, you made the interesting point there that some of this kind of, to me, it feels like the roar of a forgotten people when we see people taken to the streets and saying,
You're
"Look,"
G.K. Chesterton.
right,
You're doing your
yeah,
G.K.
a bit
Chesterton.
of
When the
Chesterton in
English
there.
begin to hate.
Yeah, but it's like, you said it feels a bit Ulsterish, and I was actually in Northern Ireland just a couple of months ago, and I was struck by the exact same thing as you. It's like another planet entirely. It's not like a part of the United Kingdom. It's so one street is festooned with Union flags, the next one is covered with Irish
It
stricken.
even extends to which you support abroad. Suddenly,
Yeah,
the Protestants in Ulster become immensely pro-Israel,
that's right. Yeah.
and the IRA passionately Palestinian.
Yeah, the only place in the United Kingdom where you'll see lots of Israel flags is in parts of
Is
Protestant
Shankill
Belfast.
Road.
It's
It's the
Shankill Road.
Shankill Road.
But in relation to the pushback that we're seeing, so the protests at some of these migrant hotels, which I think are very interesting, ordinary, decent people, lots of mums, lots of women.
Women,
The
that's most
women.
surprising thing, yeah.
So when you say it's like it feels Ulsterish, and I understand what you mean because it's not particularly English to wave the flag and put up a lamppost and to have it on every street. But do you think people feel like all the other avenues for them to speak out against this system or to speak out against the lies or to express themselves in the normal democratic way, all of those avenues have been so firmly shut down to them that they feel they have no choice but to wave the flag, make a spectacle? And I'm thinking of, if you think of Tower Hamlets, for example, in London, such an extraordinary situation there, where after Hamas's pogrom of 7th of October, the Palestine flag flew on the streets of Tower Hamlets for months on end, and it was only following a challenge by the UK Lawyers for Israel that they were eventually taken down. This week that we're speaking, when some English fellas put up the England flag in Tower Hamlets, it was taken down within hours. It was dragged down from the lamppost. So the Palestine flag lasts for months, and the England flag lasts for a couple of hours at most. People feel so frustrated in that kind of, when they can't even wave a flag, they can't even say what they think, they can't even feel free to express themselves. So do you think it's understandable that perhaps they're resorting to a more clannish pushback because democracy, which superseded clannishness, has failed them?
Let's please not be so final. Let's not say failed. Let's not put it, please, I desperately hope not, in the past tense. I'm certainly devoting what's left of my, what I suppose, being a bit dramatic about it, life, and certainly my energies, trying to make sure that that is not the case. It's very easy to see why people feel that it is, however, which is, of course, that, and again, we need now to revert to politics. Everything we are talking about was essentially the property of the left. It came from Democrat America via the infatuations of the Labour Party. But the catastrophe is, in 2010, the incoming well, it was then a coalition, but coalition dominated by the Conservatives government, and it prefaced 14 years of Conservative government, did nothing to push back at all. Conservatism bought into this astonishingly radical change, despite the fact, and this is what is so astonishing, the Conservative Party, remember, is invented in response to the gigantic constitutional change of the 1832 Reform Act. It's in 1835 that Robert Peel invents the word conservative, but of course it begins, Brandon, this is the really interesting thing, but I'm trying to get everybody to understand. It begins with a concession. The Conservatives in 1835, in the Tamworth Manifesto, in the general election that year, said, we are going to accept the Reform Act. There's then the issue of, well, why should you actually react to any other change? Why should you resist any other change? And you can see Peel desperately trying to think of, well, how do I say I'm going to accept one but not accept the others? And the Conservative Party, again, it's a beauty and the importance of British conservatism. It was never simply reactionary. As the parties of the left, the conservative, the right wing parties of Europe, which were straightforwardly reactionary, and of course, in the later 19th, early 20th century, became simply fascistic. The Conservative Party here recognized we were a progressive country where there was change, and in really the super intelligent conservatives, like Disraeli, understood how you respond to change, that you've got to have a notion of what is good change and what is bad change. And Disraeli came up with this masterly formula that you only accept change when it's in the broad lines with the tradition of your country and not what we've been taught. Disraeli actually anticipates this in 1835. You do not change in accordance with the principles of international liberalism. He spotted it even then. And the trouble is that conservatism is not held on to that basic insight. And you can see why. Because the areas of debate shifted. In 1945, it became about economics and socialism. But you know what? In 1951, the Conservatives made exactly the same mistake. Churchill went along with what Attlee had done, which is why we're still saddled with the absurdities of an unfunded NHS. Extraordinary. The man who invented these ideas, Beveridge, wanted them to be funded. He wanted them to be insurance-based, which makes them affordable. And instead, particularly Bevan rather, now and Bevan, took the decision. You wanted jam today, and you introduce an entirely unfunded welfare state on top of a broken, war-torn economy. It was deranged. But the Conservatives go along with it, and it takes Margaret Thatcher to break it. But of course, Thatcher again focuses on the economic side of the thing. So when Blair professes, I think correctly, that he will adhere with Thatcherite economics, you're completely blind to the fact that he's carrying out this gigantic double change, both of the constitution and increasingly the population. But the Conservatives failed to see that. Again, economic doctrine, treasury doctrine. Oh, immigration is good for the economy. Oh, we are liberal conservatives. Oh, David Cameron, our greatest achievement. I'm gay. Our greatest achievement was gay marriage. Insanity, absolute insanity that a conservative should say that. But that's why people are so furious and so frustrated. That it's that neither political party. And do you know what, Brendan? I hear myself say this and I think, good God, where have your critical faculties gone? That's mine. I'm sounding like a web conspiracy theorist, uniparty and whatever. But you know what? It's been true. It really has been true. We've effectively had the same government with similar dominating figures since John Major. One figure in particular, Jeremy Haywood, running right through this. And I think at the heart of the problem, the heart of the rot of the Cabinet Office, the heart of the rot in Downing Street. And it was Haywood, by the way, just to illustrate the point, who was responsible for introducing Cameron to Greensill. That's why people are so frustrated. The so-called magnificent victory of Starmer was, of course, nothing of the sort. That only 2/3 of the people vote, and only a third of that 2/3 vote for Starmer, which means effectively he gets a sweeping majority on the basis of 1/5 of the electorate. It's a vote against the Conservatives. It took 14 years for them to get to that point. It's taken 12 months for Labour to now be in the same position, which is why, of course, you get reform soaring in the opinion polls. Not because people particularly trust Nigel Farage, not because they're persuaded by the platform of reform, which is an absurd confusion, as we all know, not because reform has done anything, because it's not the other two. And it's this terrible doctrine, Brendan, that's pervaded by, in one form or another, by the whole PPE school at Oxford. Its most visible representative in the press, the old one was Daniel Finkelstein. Its new one is Fraser Nelson. That politics is won from the centre. This strange middle ground, where, as we all know, in the middle of the road you get run over. There is, of course, absolutely no evidence for this at all. It may be true in easy times, But again, it's the evacuation of meaning from politics. This whole notion of the Finkelsteins and whatever, that politics is won by 2p on income tax and 1p off another tax, that it's this minute retail offer. Again, the whole cult of this thing called optics, what policy looks like, the sudden extraordinary prominence of propaganda, and the sudden fact you've now got government by propaganda. You see it particularly with another subject we should be talking about, the fact that our economy and our fiscal position is hanging by a thread. 30-year bonds are trading at 6%. It's the highest level for 27 years. But what you have, of course, is a Chancellor of the Exchequer who governs by juju, seeks to govern by juju. You think if you utter the word growth repeatedly, growth happens, in the same way that if you're transgender, you think if you say, I am a woman, mysteriously, you become a woman. And it is this absurdity. And Rachel Reeves, again, is doing everything that every sensible economist knows will suppress growth. You're increasing regulation. You're increasing, particularly regulation in the workplace, all the activities of Angela Rayner. At the same time, you impose, can you believe you're talking about we want growth, and the first big fiscal change you make is to impose a tax on jobs,
Yeah.
employers, national insurers. The sheer, this is a politics of the madhouse.
But David, I want to speaking of the madhouse. I think it's very apt to raise these economic questions, and I did have one for you in a moment. But I speaking of the madhouse, I did want to come back briefly to the grooming gang question, because you touched on that earlier. You made a really interesting point, which I think will get listeners thinking, which is that these aren't gangs, they're clans. They behave like clans. But the reason I wanted to get your further thoughts on this issue is because this is one of the issues that exploded at the start of this year. As you've already mentioned, the heroic Andrew Norfolk, who sadly died earlier this year, who, counter to what Elon Musk and others might say about there having been no coverage of this issue. In fact, he was doggedly covering it for years and years. But what's so interesting to people, I think, about this issue and this scandal in particular is not only the existence of these gangs or clans, as you refer to them, and how they behave, why they behave in that way, which you're touching on there, but also the interplay of that with officialdom's response or lack of response, or the
And not
unwillingness.
simply official, political.
Political, official, the police, the
The
media. I mean,
councils.
a whole gamut of the state that is supposed to protect its citizens just completely abandoned that project for a period of time. How do you explain the interweaving, firstly, of the existence of those kinds of gatherings of men in certain parts of the country, but then also the way in which that crashes against this unwillingness to have an open discussion about this problem, or to tackle it, or to confront the nature of it? What is the explosive dynamic there, do you think?
Well, the explosive dynamic is very simple, that if you have a high trust, highly individualized society like ours, and you introduce clan structures that have communal values into it, the in-group, that's to say us, those who are supposedly the majority group, will be taken for a complete ride by the incomer group. That's the problem, that we have no means to resist them. It has actually taken over whole sections of the British state. It has clearly taken over local councils. Why has it taken over local councils? Because it offers a mass vote, especially if you're foolish enough to have a postal ballot and you've got families in which obviously the dependents vote according to the wishes and directions of the head man. That's what goes on. We know this is how it happens. That means that you deliver what in a deteriorating system of sub-democratic politics, which is what we've got now. It is the wonderful thing. The left, look at the trade unions. It's always been very fond of the block vote, the en masse vote. These groups, Muslim of course, these Muslim communities offer absolute gold dust. They offer manna. they offer a total block vote. And again, with this way in which local government is organized by wards and so on, you will get, and I know this, my background is I was born in Kendal, in Westmoreland, but my family comes from Oldham and Rochdale. I know these places. I know them well. I know how individual streets and districts have been taken over literally by one village in the foothills of the Punjab or whatever it is, and you've just transferred that community from there to there. And of course, they take over a ward, and then they take over a council, and at which point the machinery of local government is taken over too. At which point, one particular party, 90% apparently of Pakistani immigrants, vote for the Labour Party. You then, again, local government, unfortunately, in the 1970s was politicized. Before the 1970s, local government was largely unpoliticized, or very much less politicized than it is now. The dominant figures, I mean, we're talking about Belfast, as we all know now. If you go to Belfast City Hall, it's a kind of parody of Stormont. If you look at the figures who built it, they were the great owners of the shipyards. The people who were active in local government were the great and successful businessmen. And unfortunately, once local government is taken over by politicians, then that magic of the block vote. So, and the police force operate on a local level. The police force, again, isn't it interesting? Because they're supposed, are they not? Everything follows through. Following the Lawrence report, they are supposed to represent the communities they serve. So DEI requires that they hire large numbers of, well, in these cases, Pakistanis. And you've got a Labour Party dominated, you've got a local authority dominated, you've got a police force dominated, you've got social workers dominated. Is it any wonder that these girls were treated as they were? This is why there is this profound resistance. This is why the Labour Party cannot allow a proper national inquiry, because it will expose its own underbelly. And of course, the Labour Party is clinging on to this, in my view, with entire folly, because it's going to lose these areas. These areas are all going to be taken over by the Fruit and Nut Party. We are going to see a new extreme left Islamic party emerging as a major force in the next election. Not so the Jess Phillips and whatever, who are perjuring themselves, who are rendering their entire previous careers a mockery. I think Phillips is the particular disgrace. She was Ladywood, wasn't she? The Ladywood constituency in Birmingham. She experienced foulest abuse from Islamic forces. She was railed at in her own victory speech, and what does she immediately do? She takes the knee to them. She takes the knee to them at the time of the Southport riots, when, of course, in her constituency, there were outrageous cases of open militarization. We're talking now of not simply gangs in the sense of rape gangs, open militarizations. Pakistani men wearing black balaclavas, carrying sticks, and you will remember encountered by a Pakistani police officer who says what? We don't want trouble, do we? Park your weapons in the mosque and nobody will do anything.
David, I could talk to you for hours more, but I'm just going to ask you one more question before I let you go. I firstly want to say something you said earlier about the uniparty. I think lots of people feel like we live under a uniparty. I don't even think that's a particularly controversial point anymore. I mean, the similarity between the parties is extraordinary. But my final question for you is just on, I don't want to ask you about the future of everything, because, you know, I
silly.
like, that would be silly. And I like the fact you're still positive about democracy. So am I, by the way. I think it can be saved. But I want to ask you about where you think wokeness is going. You've touched upon the trans lunacy, which every now and then I think it's disappearing. Then I think it might actually come back. We've got this current controversy with the Polari Prize where John Boyne is being boycotted because he dares to think that if you've got a penis, you're a man, not a woman. We've obviously had Trump's revolt against DEI in the United States, although people want to push it back into force. Similar questions are being raised here in a roundabout way. What do you think is the future of that kind of politics? The identity politics, the trans politics, the gender fluid lunacy? Just to finish off, where do you think that stuff can be put back in its box as well?
I think the important thing to recognize is that on the one hand, it is the lunacy, as you describe it. But the reason it's so powerful and why we can do something about it is because it's legally entrenched. The reason that the sheer ineffable silliness of transgender, it's completely mad. You've only got to look at them. These are people who are seriously ill. If a man says he's Napoleon, we all go there and put him in hospital. If a man says he's a woman, oh, and by the way, if he dresses up like Napoleon, even more so. If a man says he's a woman and dresses up like one, do you know what? We make it a protected characteristic. The catastrophe of the Equality Act, which makes both gender, this invented thing, that's to say, sex considered as a social construct, and biological sex, you make them both protected characteristics, which sets up the extraordinary war that we've seen in the Supreme Court. Um, Interestingly enough, you have another question. Why is it particularly prominent in Scotland? Why has it been so extraordinarily prominent in Ireland? It is because both in Scotland and Ireland, you have vicious nationalisms, profound, really nasty, armpit scratching, especially in Ireland, anti-English nationalism. What you have to do is to deodorize, underarm. You've got to deodorize it. And the way you've deodorized it is by adopting the craziest extreme limits of fashionable Democrat. Why is Ireland, having processions of drag queens going round primary schools? Why did the awful Sturgeon, what struck me about glancing at Sturgeon's memoirs wasn't simply that they were bad, they were so boring. This woman cannot write a sentence. But what she did, she commits to transgenderism to disguise the essentially proto-fascistic nature of all of those Scottish nationalism, Irish nationalism. They're blood and soil nationalisms. That's what they are. And you disguise them. So what I think is, and this is why I, deeply fond though I am of the New Culture Forum and all the rest of it, trying to tackle woke, or indeed Andrew Doyle. Andrew Doyle is doing the right thing. He tackles it by satire. That's great. But you can't fight culture with culture. That's silly. But you can fight it with law. And the essential thing that all of us, all those of us on the right, and we're right, by the way, in every sense of the way, what we've got to do, what we've got to work to happen is, whatever the shape of the government that succeeds this one, it has to be prepared wholly to alter the legal basis of the Blairite state. The power of these elites that we were talking about, those who've lied to us about transgenderism, those who've lied to us about multiculturalism, those who've lied to us about the wonders of globalism, or the nonsense we're seeing in the Ukraine and Gaza, the rules-based international order. All of these are the same people, and all of these things are entrenched in law. They're entrenched by the rule of the experts that the Blairites created. They're entrenched by the universities whose growth in unlimited growth they fostered. They're entrenched above all by this catastrophic legal system. Do you realize we actually changed the very basis of our legal system? This is catastrophic. This is catastrophic, but we can change it. But we can only change it if the right here is as well prepared as Trump was for his second term, and I would argue better. There are two vast tasks of the right at the moment. One is the task of public propaganda, to develop and entrench the majorities for whatever right-wing coalition, and I'm sure it will be a right-wing coalition that comes to power following what I imagine will be the total collapse of the Labour Party in a pincer movement from right and left. We talked about the left, the Islamic leftish party that will cut away a huge part of the radical support, and particularly the 16-year-olds that are about to enfranchise. But the essential task that we've got to do is this propaganda, this I'm afraid I'm using that word again, to build up an overwhelming majority. So you're not simply with a notional majority. 31% is not enough. Otherwise, we'll be left in exactly the same position of a government wanting to do radical things and unable to do it. We need we need to be in the 40, preferably the 50%. If there's this huge disenchantment with politics, we should be able to get there. But above all, the essential thing, and this is one of the many things that I'm working on at the moment, we need to have a proper, fully developed program for government. Just like that great pile of executive orders that Trump had. We need to have the acts of parliament that will reverse the incorporation of the ECHR into British law. We need to have the acts of parliament that will undo the catastrophe of the yielding of control of interest rates and everything else, untouched, with entirely uncontrollable to people as incompetent as Andrew Bailey, the worst governor in the 300-year history of the Bank of England. Somebody, governors of central banks are supposed to be gnomic, are supposed to be cryptic. When you actually listen to Andrew Bailey, what you hear is, I'm not sure. He's incoherent, not cryptic. The idea of an incoherent central banker is a novel invention of this age of degeneracy. So what we've got to do, we've got to have a legislative program worked out to the last detail. We've got to have the notion of how you will deal with those first few days in power, first few hours in power. Will there be a declaration of a state of emergency? What will one do to take control of the House of Lords? All of this has got to be worked out. There's got to be a plan. If we don't do that, if we come to power simply saying, you saw what happened with the Labour Party, they thought they could waltz into power. Even the Blob itself, Keir Starmer is the incarnation of the Blob. He's the chief blob. He's the ultimate blob. Even the blob himself can't control the blob. It won't work for anybody. We've got to know how to demolish it quickly, and how. But this you should be immediately saying, this sounds like a revolution. It's not. It's a restoration. And we did it before. This is why I'm optimistic. We had genuine, terrible, and in some ways wonderful, as revolutions are. And look at how Wordsworth changes his mind about the French one. We had a huge revolution in the 17th century. It's us, not the French, who first publicly try a king and cut his head off, except we do it honorably and decently. But at the end of that revolution, in 1660, we decided we'd had enough. We would go back. And it's the only time a revolution has ever been reversed by a people without military intervention and of their own accord. And you didn't get it right in 1660. It took another great crisis in 1689. But broadly from then until 1997, we remember, Brendan, set the model for good government for the world. It's why everybody has got a parliament. This strange, again, that fused culture I talked about, that Anglo-Norman word, that French word with a peculiar English meaning, parliament. We set that model. We can do it again. We've got to believe, but what it needs intense preparation, and then finally, more than anything else, it needs courage. Without courage, none of the other virtues matter. We need courage.
David, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thanks again to PIA VPN for sponsoring this episode. Take control of your digital life and get PIA for 86% off. Click the link in the show notes below or scan the QR code.